Alright, so I'm here to talk about neoliberal multiculturalism, and before there was a tow truck making a lot of noise in the parking lot, but now my refrigerator is making noise, but hey, I'm not fancy enough to record in a studio or in a cabin out in the woods. I'm just sitting here in my living room. So grab your favorite beverage because this is going to be a doozy. I'm drinking some ginger turmeric tea. Kind of looks like urine, doesn't it? But it's delicious, I promise. Grab a tea, grab a coffee, an adult beverage if you so choose, because we're going to get into it. But this topic is very important and complicated, and man, I mean, I could sit here and talk for hours and hours and hours, and I still won't cover everything that is involved and wrapped up into this topic. So please, I invite you, make video responses, comment below, be part of the conversation. So basically, I'm here to present an argument regarding neoliberal multiculturalism, and my argument is basically that it is an insufficient approach to dismantling systemic oppression. And when I say systemic oppression, I'm talking about white supremacy, heteronormativity, patriarchy, that kind of thing. The types of oppression that are built into not only individual people's preconceived notions and prejudices, but also into the laws of the state, of the nation. It's built into police practices. It's built into churches and their doctrines, right? It exists systemically across all levels of society. So, yes, basically this video was sparked by a strange encounter that I had in the comments section yesterday morning before I sat down to finally fucking finish all those fellowship applications that I've been doing. I sat down at my computer, I saw that I had a notification from YouTube that someone had commented on one of my more recent videos, and I read the comments and I was like, ah! I went back and forth, trying to decide whether or not I should link that specific video below. Ultimately, I'm not going to. Some people have been able to do some digging and they've found the specific video and read the comments. Let's just say it's a video that I've published within the last month. And the comments that this person left, I found disturbing and upsetting and misguided and insulting. And so I'm not gonna give the explicit link. You can do some digging if you want to go back and see it. So for people in my audience and people watching this video, whether you're subscribed to my channel or you stumbled upon this, please don't try to hunt down and attack and send nasty messages to the person who left those comments. That will ultimately do more harm than good. It would just feed into that false narrative that they were trying to argue on behalf of in the comments themselves. It's counterproductive, so please don't do it. So basically, the reason why this person's comments, and they wrote 2 individual comments under that particular video, the reason why I found them so problematic is they were insulting to me because in a not so subtle way, this person was trying to have an ego trip over me, basically trying to point out how spiritually enlightened and intelligent they are, And, you know, by arguing for their own enlightenment and intelligence and stuff, they're, you know, not so subtly saying that you are not, right? You are not these things that they see in themselves. So it was insulting in that way because they were assuming that they were better than me and more enlightened and spiritually progressed or developed or whatever than I am. They were also trying to justify the pain and suffering of those who have been targeted by the Trump administration and its policies and its supporters, which I found to be utterly disgusting. They were basically saying that all the evil that has been perpetrated by this administration and policies and people that support it has a higher, it's going to serve a higher good because it's part of the universe's plan to ultimately bring more people into spirituality. So basically these people suffering, like the immigrants that have been targeted who've had their children taken away, and like transgender and genderqueer people who have been targeted by the administration, and just like religious minorities and Muslims who have been targeted by this administration. Ultimately, their suffering is part of the universe's plan and is serving a higher good for the rest of us. And I find that so disturbing because to me, human suffering is ultimately meaningless in the sense that it's not part of some greater plan. It's not part of some God's plan or the universe's plan. Human suffering, most often than not, especially when we're talking about the suffering that is caused by the racist, Islamophobic, white nationalist, homophobic, transphobic policies of the Trump administration, this suffering is caused by people. It's not part of some divine plan. It's caused by, perpetuated by people, right? And those people need to be held accountable for their shit, right? So I found that very disturbing. Then in the second comment they made, they said some really interesting things about slavery. Because in the video that they were commenting on, I talked about a little bit about my research, how I do a lot of research on colonial history. I'm basically a specialist in, or well, once I graduate with my PhD, I will be a specialist in ethnic studies, specifically Latinx studies, and I'm very familiar with Latin American history and literature and cultures and performance arts, right? And Caribbean stuff too. So I talk about slavery, I study anti-blackness, I study Afro-Latinidad, like Afro-Latinx migration and literature, and you know, I incorporate queer theory and queer of color critique and queer utopianism, and I study apocalypse, and you know, I know my shit about this stuff, right? But this person was basically saying that pointing out systemic oppression means you are less spiritually developed than they are. So it's very much a, now my heater just kicked in. It's very much a see no racism, speak no racism, hear no racism viewpoint, like a colorblind kind of viewpoint. And they said some weird shit about slavery, like, you know, since slavery was practiced within Africa itself, that means that we can't or we shouldn't point fingers at white people, because that just means you're not listening to your true higher self, and you're less spiritually developed than they are because they've been practicing witch for 20 years. It was just bizarre. It was bizarre, and to me, it was quite obviously a person doing some spiritual bypassing, as we say in the spiritual, witchy, pagan-y community, i.e., they're refusing to acknowledge how they benefit from privilege and how the comforts they receive from privilege come at a price, and that price is the suffering of other people. And to me, that doesn't sound very spiritual. And so I defended myself respectfully but sternly, and you can read my responses to her comments if you so choose. But all of this is to say that a lot of what she said reminded me of neoliberal multiculturalism. Because I see a lot of neoliberal multiculturalism being employed by people on all ends of the political spectrum, by the far right, by the far left, and everybody in between. And basically, neoliberal multiculturalism is a viewpoint that only, in a nutshell, and I'm going to go more in depth into this, diversity under neoliberal multiculturalism is only valued if it does not challenge the status quo. And the reality we live in, the status quo that we are faced with, is that there are specific hierarchies in our society, and I'm talking specifically about Western society, that from my research and my expertise, I can confidently say were the result of colonialism, of 500 years of European colonialism that continues to this day, right? 500 plus years of European colonialism, keeping in mind that the Portuguese were already exploring Africa and going down the coast of Africa before Columbus ever set sail in 1492, right? So, yeah. Alright, so let's quickly talk about, or let's quickly define our terms. So what is neoliberal multiculturalism? I can't say the word even. So if we're going to talk about neoliberal multiculturalism, we first have to define what neoliberalism is in relation to capitalism, and what capitalism is in relation to kind of an academic buzzword that you might have heard called late capitalism. So I got my notes to keep me on track. So basically, capitalism is an economic and political system in which the economy is under the control and jurisdiction of the private sector and not the state. So the private sector, private business owners control the economy instead of the state, right? Socialism, in a very broad, general way, would be the opposite of that. The economy is under the control of the state, not the private sector. Very basic definition of capitalism. Neoliberalism is an economic and political philosophy regarding capitalism that basically says that the government should have even less and less and less of a role, or less and less and less control over the economy. It is pro-privatization. It is pro-deregulation. It is pro-free trade. It wants the least amount of government interference possible. Natural resources and things like that should be privatized. Utilities should be privatized, and in the private sector, everything is just free trade, free market, privatization. So capitalism is an economic system, and then neoliberalism is a philosophy about that system. In general terms here. I mean, there are whole books written about this shit, right? So I'm just kind of quickly going through these definitions. just so that we're on the same page when we're talking about this, right? Basically, just to talk about Marx for a second and Marx's critique of capitalism. Karl Marx, he was a philosopher, thinker of the mid to late 19th century. He critiqued capitalism. He talked about communism, and from Marx we get Marxist communism. Marx did not invent the idea or the concept of communism. He just put his own little spin on it, right? And basically his main critique of capitalism was that the worker was divorced from the fruits of his own labor. And I use the word his on purpose because that's the type of language that Marx used. I mean, we're talking about the 19th century, his and him were, they were the universal terms that everybody used. We don't do that anymore, thankfully. So basically Marx, you have to keep in mind the historical context that Marx lived in. He was a witness to the Industrial Revolution. He saw the machine of capitalism devouring its victims in his mind, and its victims were the proletariat, the working class, right? And so he just saw capitalism out of control, deregulated, just out of control capitalism where children were working in factories for 12 hours a day, workers were denied rights, their rights to unionize, people were forced to work 12 to 14-hour shifts, 7 days a week, never got time off, they were forced to live in poverty, they weren't given living wages. And so he saw all this horror around him and saw that the workers weren't benefiting from the fruits of their labor, the company owners were, right? The investors were, the private industry was, the leaders of the private industry. And so if you kind of think about capitalism in the 20th and 21st centuries, we can kind of see a thing going on not within the United States, for example, but outside of the United States. And this is where our definition of late capitalism comes in. Late capitalism is kind of an academic buzzword or a term that was popularized in the late 1970s and 1980s. It does date further back than that, but it wasn't really a big idea or a popular term until then, until the 70s and 80s, and it was popularized by a Marxist economist named Ernst Mandel. And he basically kind of argued that there were 3 stages to capitalism. I think he had a book based on his dissertation. He then published a book called Late Capitalism. I haven't read it, but just on the little bit of research I've done in preparation for this video, it seems that he was the one who popularized this idea of late capitalism, and it's basically capitalism in the post-World War II era of the late 20th century and into the 21st century. And it's a capitalism that is more global in its scale, in its size, right? It's neoliberal global capitalism. Capitalism as the dominant economic system throughout the world, the hegemonic economic system throughout the world, right? And it's not only global capitalism, it's neoliberal global capitalism. And so in this neoliberal global capitalist world that we live in some parts of the world, and I would argue that this is a legacy of colonialism, we see this deregulation and privatization just get out of control. And it turns into the type of capitalism that is out of control, the same type of capitalism that Marx was seeing and witnessed to. In the United States, we have certain workers' rights and certain safety regulations, and we have a minimum wage, right? Now, it is arguable whether or not that minimum wage is actually livable, and it's arguable whether or not workers really have rights, because there's all sorts of right-wing laws and, you know, politicians who are attacking unions, right? But at the very least, our working conditions are a lot better than the working conditions in the factories in other places in the world. I'm thinking across the border in Mexico, the factories in Central America, factories in Southeast Asia, factories in countries that were former colonies, right? Or formerly colonized by Western European countries who were gobbled up into this capitalist hegemonic society, and who then become the places where cheap labor is used to maximize profit. Because basically under capitalism, if you're producing a product, what is the best and quickest and easiest way to maximize your profit on that product? Reduce as much as you can how much you pay your workers, the workers who are making that product. So what does all of this have to do with multiculturalism or diversity? And basically this has to do with the idea of pluralism. And pluralism is just, it's a result of international or global neoliberal capitalism. I mean, just by the fact that the economies of different countries work with each other, and products and goods and ideas and people are moving more and more across borders, right? So pluralism and multiculturalism in the sense of racial and ethnic diversity, religious diversity, it's just becoming more and more and more a part of our reality. I mean, if you compare what our communities look like 100 years ago to now, you can definitely see that there's more movement of people and goods across borders. That's just the reality of the world we're in, right? But the way that neoliberal capitalism approaches diversity or multiculturalism is it capitalizes on it. It tries to capitalize on it. So basically diversity is only useful and profitable for multicultural or neoliberal capitalism if that diversity is not dangerous or radical, if it does not question the status quo. Alright, wardrobe change and tea change. I'm actually sipping on some sleepy time tea now. So now I think it's a good time to share some concrete examples of neoliberal multiculturalism in action, because that might help to kind of clarify how it works and why, according to my argument, it is not an appropriate way to dismantle systemic oppression. A really concrete example of how neoliberal multiculturalism is insufficient is the debate surrounding things like Title IX and affirmative action. And so I'm not going to explicitly go deep into defining what those are. I will, in the description box below, include just the links to the Wikipedia pages if you're not familiar with affirmative action, especially because that's what I'm going to spend more time focusing on for those who live outside the US and don't know what affirmative action is. But just very, very basically, and this is a watered down explanation, okay, so please refer to those links below. But affirmative action and Title IX are attempts to reserve a seat at the table for people from traditionally oppressed groups. And the reason that I would say things like Title IX and affirmative action are examples of politicized diversity, or politicized, more radical, and in my opinion more productive approaches to diversity, is because, sorry, I have you on the couch and I'm moving around, is because they attempt to reserve these seats at the table in the workplace, at colleges and universities, through legislation, through tangible efforts within rules and laws that guarantee diversity. I'll just focus on the college and university aspect of this, because that is what is most often brought up in the conversation and the debate about affirmative action. So a lot of people who are opposed to affirmative action, who just so happen to be right-wing too, not always though, they argue that, for example, if they are like a Republican voting middle-class white family and their son is about to apply to college, they claim that affirmative action takes that space or that opportunity away from their son. And if they're really racist, they would say something like, oh, you know, black and brown people don't deserve their seat at or their space or their acceptance letter at that university because they just got in because they're a minority. That is a phrase that is thrown around a lot. I've heard it a lot, both in person, but also on, you know, from Fox News pundits and shit like that, right? That just displays a fundamental misunderstanding and ignorance about the whole point of something like affirmative action and why it tries to tackle the issue of diversity head-on. Basically, let me give you some historical examples. So if you look at a university like Harvard, and Harvard is always in the news, so I'm going to pick on Harvard. Also, Harvard thinks that it's the center of the universe, and fuck that. So Harvard University is in the news lately because there is a massive lawsuit being filed against the university regarding its admission practices and how the applications of Asian and Asian American applicants were targeted and were basically thrown out or ignored because the university or the admissions department or whatever did not want too many Asian applicants or whatever. So this minority group was targeted by the admissions department and process, and a conscious effort was made to limit the number of applicants from that specific minority group. That's fucked up, and it's especially fucked up if you keep in mind that there is a history behind this, because back in the early 1900s, Harvard did the exact same thing with Jewish applicants. So basically, you have to keep in mind the history of academia itself, going all the way back to Europe, and how those traditions were carried over into other parts of the world, and the New World including. So academia has, since its inception, the university system and culture has been, since the very beginning, the realm of wealthy, white, privileged men. For centuries, that's how it's been. That's just how it's been. Now, if you know, in an American context, if you move into and study the history of the 19th century, you do see the beginning of some colleges being established specifically for women. I'm thinking of the Seven Sisters colleges like Vassar, Brown, Wellesley, like these types of institutions. But still, they were for wealthy, white, privileged women. And still, they existed because women weren't allowed to go to the other places, and this includes the public universities, the state universities. Women, I mean, in the South even, just to make this more explicit, just look at the history of the 1950s and 60s with desegregation efforts. You have the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, stating that over his dead body will Negro students enter into the University of Alabama, right? And the National Guard had to be sent in to enforce the federal laws regarding desegregation, and it was just a huge hoopla. So not even 50 or 60 years ago, these universities in many parts of the country did not allow students of color at all. So if you keep in mind all of that history of hundreds of years of exclusion, affirmative action starts to make more sense. It makes a lot of sense. And to me, it's necessary. However, if you choose to ignore all that hundreds of years of history, then you can blissfully, live in your ignorance and just claim that people targeted by affirmative action, racial minorities, gender minorities, ethnic minorities, are stealing spots away from your kids who for some reason deserve that spot more than anybody else, So affirmative action is just such a concrete example of the difference between a neoliberal multicultural approach to diversity, which is the typical college brochure, these staged photos where students in different classes are randomly selected, and Black and brown students and Muslim students and students from other underrepresented groups are always randomly selected to sit in these staged photos so that the college can project this progressive, diverse image of itself, while at the same time it can continue to discriminate or underrepresent those students and students from those groups. If you look at the statistics of what the colleges or universities' student body is made up of, it's still, at the university that I'm close to right now, the university where I study, it's still very much white and middle and upper class, right? So you have the image versus the reality. And so you have the college brochure, neoliberal capitalist approach to diversity, which is literally superficial, right? And just mistakes representation for actual diversity, versus a real concrete way to approach the problem seen in Title IX and affirmative action that challenges the status quo. One doesn't challenge it, one does. And the one that does is a divisive political topic precisely because it challenges the status quo, because it forces us to recognize that history of exclusion and discrimination head on, and because it uses laws and legislation and concrete measures to attempt to really install real diversity, right? So I hope that example kind of clarified some things. Before I move on to specifically talk about how neoliberal multiculturalism pops up in the witchy, spiritual, new agey, pagan-y community, I do want to give an example that I was witness to in my personal life because it involved somebody that I knew, and this is an example that touches on something that I think is not talked about nearly enough. So I have a friend who has a child, and this child has autism. They are on the spectrum. I used to babysit and tutor this child. And so my friend, after homeschooling their child for a while, they recognized that it would be good for their child's development to practice social skills and just to get out of the house, because sometimes being in the house for a long time, being homeschooled and stuff, the kid was getting bored, So it would just be good for the child to go to school. And so my friend was looking into private schools, and now I'm not a fan of the privatization of education, because I think access to education is like having access to clean water and healthcare. I think it's a human right. Now, I totally understand why parents send their children to private schools, because they just want the best for their child. And in this country anyway, because so many things and resources are privatized, and because there's so much under-addressed segregation, not just racial segregation, but also socioeconomic class segregation, that it just weakens the public education system in so many parts of this country. And a lot of these problems aren't fully understood or fully addressed. So that's just the reality of it. And so a lot of parents, if they have the financial means, they will send their children to private institutions. So my friend was looking at a private school, and this school sold itself as very liberal, very progressive, very diverse. And basically the school was saying, like, look, like, we're a private school, our tuition is ridiculous, but, you know, people who can afford it actually pay for the tuition of a certain percentage of students who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, a certain percentage of the students are black and brown. Like, look how progressive, look how diverse we are. However, they ultimately rejected my friend's child because this child has autism. And basically, the diversity that this child was bringing to the table wasn't valued as a commodity for this private school to exploit. It wasn't the right kind of diversity. It wasn't the type of diversity that they could pitch as part of their selling point, because this very liberal, supposedly liberal progressive school was in a very liberal and progressive neighborhood, in a very liberal and progressive part of the country. So I just wanted to give this example because it's not only it's an example of how people on the left can fall into the traps of neoliberal multiculturalism if they understand diversity as just a selling point, if they try to commodify it. And it's also an example of a disability rights issue, right? And I think oftentimes when conversations about diversity or about systemic oppression come up, we usually go to the holy trinity of discussion points being race, class, or gender, or race, gender, and sexuality. And oftentimes the question of the specific experiences and discrimination faced by non-neurotypical people and differently abled people is not addressed, or if it's addressed, it's not addressed enough, right? Just to give you a happy ending though, this child is now in a school. They found a good school for them and they are flourishing. But yeah, I just wanted to include that because it's such an important piece to the puzzle of this question of neoliberal multiculturalism, to show how, you know, like that classic phrase, the road to perdition is paved with good intentions, right? This school and its administration might have had good intentions, claiming that they were diverse and progressive because a certain percentage of the students came from whatever type of background or were from whatever minority group, but ultimately they discriminated against differently abled people, right? Because the type of diversity that this child was bringing to the table wasn't valued, it wasn't exploitable. It wasn't part of their selling point or whatever. So that is ultimately a failure of the people running that school, and their loss too, because that kid is fucking wonderful. Anyway, just wanted to throw that in there to remind everybody of that part of the conversation that's obviously or oftentimes missing. So when it comes to addressing neoliberal multiculturalism in the Pagan-y, Witchy community, I want to address really 3 points. However, I feel it's only right to go kind of in depth with 2 of these points, because the third one really deserves a video on its own. So I want to talk about how neoliberal multiculturalism pops up in some new agey beliefs that I'm not a fan of, and how it pops up in the publishing industry, specifically with tarot and oracle decks, and also the question of cultural appropriation. And now cultural appropriation, it is a topic that deserves a video in and of itself, but it's important to mention because I view cultural appropriation as just, it's a product of global capitalism, really. Just the increased interactions between people across borders and across cultures. It's just, of course, people are going to pick up on the practices and beliefs of others or try to learn from them. And again, with multicultural or with cultural appropriation, it's important to keep in mind colonial history. And I'm gonna have to get into this in a separate video, but I just wanted to mention it because it is a huge topic. It's a topic that comes and goes in the YouTube Pagan Witchy conversation, and I think it should continue to be a topic that comes up over and over and over again because it is just so important that we address it, because it's happening, right? And it's something that I've had to do some soul searching about and actually change some of my viewpoints and change some of my tools and my approaches to things myself. So I'm going to talk about that in a separate video. So when it comes to the New Agey beliefs and how I think that they feed into neoliberal multiculturalism, I'm addressing specifically the love and light and everything positive kind of approach to life and spirituality that we see in a lot of New Age practices. I myself don't fully identify with the New Age because I do see some of its viewpoints and beliefs, like general viewpoints and beliefs of the movement, problematic, and I'm gonna touch on that a little bit here. However, I've benefited from some New Age ideas and some New Age tools. Like, I work with crystals. I think a lot of our conversations about psychoanalysis come from the New Age and how the New Age has put its own spin on, the works of Jung and things like that. I have benefited from it. However, this emphasis on everything has to be positive and love and light, I think, is an oversimplification of reality, personally. If the comments are still up, I don't know, can people who comment on other people's videos then delete their comments? Or is it up there forever and I have to go in and delete them, like as the video creator? I don't know, but if the person's comments are still up that I mentioned at the beginning of this video as the inspiration for this video, you will see this emphasis on positivity and light. They specifically use the word light throughout their comments. And basically, to me, that is just spiritual bypassing because you want to avoid uncomfortable topics. And if you work within that paradigm of light, that means you also recognize whatever might be dark. And I know, we use labels and paradigms and dichotomies for a reason because they help us grasp from phenomena and understand why things happen and might put things into perspective. But ultimately, to me, as a chaos witch, as someone who studies chaos theory, at a certain point, you have to recognize that just labeling something light and dark doesn't mean that those things are actually light or dark. At a certain point, those dichotomies and those labels become meaningless. Like, you have to recognize that those are human creations that we are imposing on the outside world to understand the outside world, right? This is how language works. works. This is how labeling things work, right? So she was basically saying that love and unity and just following the universe and trusting the universe was light, and therefore she was implying that talking about politics and talking about race and white supremacy was dark. Not that it was evil, but that it was less spiritually evolved and promoted division, right? And this is a type of reasoning or a type of discursive tool that you're going to see with like Fox News pundits, for example. I have seen from clips of watching Fox News, you will see from time to time, whenever the question of race comes up, the Fox News right-wing political pundit will basically say that the reason racism is still a problem in this country is because black and brown people won't shut up about it. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but that is basically what they're saying. And that's, first of all, victim blaming and disgusting, but also demonstrates a willful ignorance about how this kind of shit works, about how white supremacy works. And it just, I saw that line of reasoning in this person's comments to my video. It was very much a colorblind perspective and also a victim blaming perspective, in the sense that she not so subtly insinuated that anybody who talks about politics and race and oppression is perpetuating the problem instead of fixing the problem. And I guess, according to this person, the way to fix the problem is to just not talk about it. How convenient for white people. You know, for example, how convenient for white people for, you know, no one to be able to talk about race anymore. That just fixes the problem, doesn't it? Just like, you know, how convenient for men if all of us bitches would just shut up about sexism and feminism. That will just clean everything up, wouldn't it? It's just this emphasis on positivity and love and light, I feel emphasizes or promotes an unhealthy imbalance in your approach to life, because whatever you decide to label as negative or dark or less spiritually developed then becomes something that must be avoided or suppressed. And so that is just a very general, I guess, my way of just generally kind of approaching some of my critiques of New Age beliefs or beliefs that are attributed to the New Age. I fully understand that not everybody who considers themselves as part of the New Age believes in this kind of crap, but you have to recognize that the love and light and positivity, the obsession with everything has to be positive and enlightened, and, you know, everything has to be perfect and positive and bubbly and nice, and we need to avoid talking about dark things, whatever those are. It's a prevalent thing in the New Age. It's prevalent, it's there. In the short amount of time that I've been on YouTube, and I started my YouTube channel June 2015, so I've been on for roughly 3.5 years now. Even within that short amount of time, I have noticed a change in discussions surrounding tarot and oracle decks, and I think that this is a necessary change. I think it's important, but I don't think that it's enough. And what I'm referring to is, and my heat just kicked in again, in a lot of tarot and oracle deck unboxings or reviews, the question of diversity often comes up, and it's either in praise of the deck for its inclusiveness, for including differently abled people, like people in wheelchairs, for including women wearing hijabs, for including black and brown folk, for including gender queer folk, you know. So it's either in praise of the deck for being inclusive, or it's a critique of the deck for not being inclusive enough. Now, I think this is very important as consumers and collectors of tarot decks. I think it's great to demand diversity and representation. However, I don't think we should stop and pat ourselves on the back and think that the job is done. I don't think it's enough, right? Let me give you an example. There are several oracle decks out there that thematically focus on Native American and indigenous beliefs and practices. I have noticed that not all, but quite a few of these types of decks are made by white people. I find this problematic, especially if these decks are mass market decks, if they are published by mass market publishers instead of independently published. I find this problematic because I think if we are going to buy a product, if we are going to consume a product based on a minority culture, the least we could do is support a deck creator who actually comes from that culture. So I do not want you to go out and burn your oracle decks that are themed around indigenous beliefs and spirituality simply because they were made by white people. I don't want you to get angry at me either. Check yourself before you wreck yourself, right? What I do ask of you is that you just, next time, if a deck catches your eye, do a little bit more research about it. Seek out deck creators that actually come from the cultures that are being represented in the deck. I think that is utterly important because we can't just stop at the level of representation. Representation is a very neoliberal multicultural thing. It's a very superficial approach to diversity. We need to actually start supporting more and more deck creators who come from these underrepresented groups. Now, I might be wrong about what I'm about to say because I'm not balls deep in the tarot community. I'm not balls deep in the publishing side of things, so I could be wrong, but I can't help but notice a pattern that the decks and deck creators that are made by people who come from underrepresented groups. I'm thinking of the Dust to Onyx tarot deck. I'm thinking of the Next World tarot deck. I can't help but notice that those decks and creators that overtly address in a very political way diversity are more often than not self-published. They're not often picked up by mass market publishers. And you have to sit and think about that. Again, I could be wrong. I mean, if you are on the inside of the publishing world, please correct me if I'm wrong, but that is just the impression I have. That is the pattern that I have seen in general. So this is what I mean when I say we need to demand more than just more diverse representation within the decks. We need to demand more diverse creators and artists and writers being published, not just independently, but on a mass market scale, because that would actually show that these mass market publishing companies truly value diversity more than just treating diversity as a commodity that they can exploit, right? As a resource for them to sell their image to an audience. So, in summary, before people start trying to put words in my mouth and getting defensive, am I saying that white tarot and oracle deck creators cannot include people of color in their tarot decks, for example, or include people from underrepresented groups that they might not be a part of in their tarot decks or oracle decks. Absolutely not. I think that that's a good first step, but it's just the first step, right? And you know, I believe in my according to my own personal ethics, my own personal approach to this, if a tarot deck or an oracle deck is going to claim to be based on indigenous beliefs and practices, or based on the spiritual beliefs and practices of the Indian subcontinent, for example, or based on Afro-diasporic beliefs and practices, it should be made. Like, if that deck is focused on that theme, is just about that theme, I think that deck should be created by a person that is a part of that culture. When it comes to mass market publishers, I think it's okay to demand that these publishers and publishing companies not only support diversity because that makes them look good, but to actually support diverse authors and creators too, and actually support decks that politicize diversity instead of just treating diversity as, you know, the new standard, or diversity as just representation, or diversity as just a selling point, right? In summary, what can we do about all of this? What can we, as witchy, pagan-y, spiritual, new agey folk, do about all of this? Well, on top of what I just said about, you know, promoting and supporting diverse authors and creators, for those of us who come from more privileged backgrounds, or who enjoy certain amounts of privilege in some way, shape, or form, I'm talking about all of us, it's important for us to reflect on that. It's important for us to try to understand that. Now, you don't need to have a PhD in anything to research about this. You don't need to have access to a university library to research about multiculturalism, to research and try to educate yourself about privilege and racism and white supremacy and heteronormativity and all these academic buzzwords. You have the internet. If you're watching this video, that means in some way, shape, or form, you have access to an internet Wi-Fi, or, you know, some sort of internet connection, and that means you can Google this shit. Like, literally, Wikipedia is your friend. We are living in such an incredible time where the human species on a global scale is more connected and interconnected than ever before. And actually, that is one of the few positive results of colonialism and neoliberal capitalism, I would say. It's not all bad, right? One of the good things that has come out of this is our interconnectedness, and the internet is one of the tools that we use for that, right? So Google is your friend. Also, I think it's very important for us to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves, in the sense that we do the spiritual and emotional work. It is hard. For example, if you are a white person, and some of the things I've said might have rubbed you the wrong way, and you might feel these defensive feelings come up. You might want to reach across the screen and, you know, rip my throat out, or you might want to grab that keyboard or grab your phone and start typing out that defensive comment because you feel like I took it too far, or you feel like I'm attacking you, I'm calling you racist, you know. Slow down that emotional train and take your time to try to understand where those feelings are coming from. A lot of it has to do with defensiveness from the ego, because in general, I would say no one enjoys being called a racist. But in the general populace, no matter which end of the political spectrum you identify with, no matter who you voted for. No one enjoys being called a racist, just like most people don't enjoy being called a sexist, or most people don't enjoy being called out for discriminating against non-neurotypical people. However, it's important to try to see where those feelings are coming from, because maybe you do hold some prejudiced beliefs about XYZ group of people. And once you realize that, maybe you can start to trace back where those beliefs came from. For me, I was raised by Republican voting, conservative white parents in a white predominant rural part of the country, Kentucky, right? So a lot of the bullshit that I learned about race and about sexuality and stuff came from my community, came from my parents. And as I left that community and went to college and started learning about feminism and took classes about the history of race and sexuality in this country, and then eventually started studying Latin America, all of that knowledge that I was exposed to and people I was exposed to and experiences I was exposed to helped me to realize that, oh shit, I did hold prejudiced beliefs about XYZ group of people. Oh shit, I didn't even realize that about myself. And once you make those kinds of realizations, you really have two choices. You can either go the unhealthy ego-driven route that doesn't want to admit it, and then gets defensive and then starts discriminating against people even more or refusing to change your beliefs, or you can go the route of unfucking yourself. Of uncolonizing, decolonizing your mind, deconditioning yourself. And actually this leads me to talk about a couple of videos that I would like to make. So the first being, of course, my experiences being real about myself, or being real with myself about cultural appropriation and my viewpoints on cultural appropriation that I mentioned before. But also I would like to, if he's willing, I would like to sit down and record a conversation with my partner, with my husband, because recently I've given him some feminist homework, as we call it. He is reading this book that I gave him. It's called The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love by the amazing Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks. And this book is Bell Hooks talking about why patriarchy not only hurts women, it hurts men too, and how men will benefit if we get rid of patriarchy. So he is reading this, and he every day he comes home because he reads this between teaching classes and stuff, so he only reads a few pages at a time, but every time I pick him up from work, he always tells me about what he's reading and how that made him reflect on like bullshit his father told him when he was growing up, and his own experiences, and how he was taught to never express his feelings, and he was taught to be homophobic. You know, it's okay to reflect upon your experiences and the way you were raised and realize, you know what, 10, 12, 15, 20 years ago, I used to be homophobic, or I used to be racist, or I used to be misogynist. More and more people need to have those realizations, and we need to be more vocal about it, right? Because there is an other side to this. And the whole point of this book for Bell Hooks is to show men what that other side looks like. And that other side requires the dismantling of patriarchy, because patriarchy hurts men too. White supremacy hurts white people too. It makes us more prone to deny the humanity of others. It makes us feel comfortable and ignore the fact that that comfort comes from the suffering of others. Sexism and misogyny hurts men too. Homophobia hurts straight people too, because it makes us assholes. It just You know, we can all benefit from dismantling systemic oppression. Just to wrap this video up, we can all benefit from dismantling systemic oppression, right? And for me, for this video, that means understanding and decolonizing our understanding of what diversity is, and really to repoliticize diversity and to make concrete, tangible efforts for diversity in all of its forms: racial diversity, diversity and acceptance for differently abled and non-neurotypical people, where non-neurotypical people are valued as full members of society instead of just being treated like they're less than human because they're different. Diversity in terms of sexual identification, diversity in terms of gender identity, diversity in terms of ethnic background, religious background. Just really what I'm trying to promote here is this idea that neoliberal multiculturalism is not enough, and if we keep depending on it for diversity, these problems like white supremacy, heteronormativity, xenophobia, they're going to keep going, and they're going to keep hurting people. And we inadvertently might be part of that problem. We might be part of the problem and not part of the solution. So, this was a doozy of a video. Please comment below. Please be part of the conversation. If you disagree with me, that's fine. Just be respectful in your comments. If I see any crazy like racist shit or slurs or pejorative language going on down the comments, of course I'm just gonna delete it. I'm not gonna feed into that crap, but I do respect opinions and perspectives. And like I said toward the beginning of this video, or in the first part of this video, because I think this is gonna have to be 2 parts, there's no way that I could touch on every aspect of this issue. There's no way. I would have to sit here and make videos every day for a whole year straight, and I still wouldn't even cover everything. So please fill in the gaps. Please share your opinions and your experiences, and keep the conversation going. So until next time, many blessings. Bye.